To thank everyone for joining us. We are the Fellowship Committee at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and we are going to take the time today to kind of go over the different fellowship opportunities, the application process, and hopefully answer as many questions as we can as it relates to the fellowships that we have set up. So we'll start with introductions. My name is Adani Washington. I started as a fellow with the Digital Justice Initiative in 2020, and I'm currently Associate Counsel with the Digital Justice Initiative, and that is as of 2021.
My name is Sophia Fernandez Gold. My pronouns are she, her. I started out as a fellow in the Voting Rights Project through a school-sponsored fellowship. And then after a year of that fellowship, was hired on as Associate Counsel in the Voting Rights Project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annika Dunbar-Gronke. I use they, them pronouns, and I am currently a Skadden Fellow with the Fair Housing and Community Development Project, and I just started in September of 2021.
Hi, all. My name is Ryan Snow. I use he, him pronouns. I am an Associate Counsel with the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee, and I started also on a school-sponsored fellowship in 2018, and then was stayed on through a Lawyers Committee funded fellowship for another year plus, and then I started as an associate counsel in February of last year. So really excited to be with you all today virtually, and I'm just going to be giving a little bit of background. I'll start with just a little bit of background on the organization. The Lawyers Committee was Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law was formed in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy, in order to leverage the power of the private bar to enforce our nation's civil rights laws, which of course were on the cusp. Some of the major ones were on the cusp of being passed, and there was some kind of recognition that the Department of Justice should not be the only one enforcing it, which of course we've seen borne out to great degree. Today, the Lawyers Committee is one of the nation's leading civil rights, racial justice organizations, legal organizations, and uses legal advocacy of all kinds to achieve racial justice, fighting inside and outside the courts, to ensure that Black people and other people of color have the voice, opportunity, and power to make the promises of our democracy real. Our major areas of work are voting rights, economic justice, criminal justice, educational opportunities, fair housing and community development, the James Byrd Center to Stop Hate, public policy, special litigation and advocacy, and digital justice. We have about 80 to 90 staff, including attorneys, organizers, administrative and support staff, legal fellows, and both legal and undergraduate interns. And our legal fellowship program is really integral to the work we do because our legal fellows are involved in all aspects of our legal work. Currently, we have about 10 legal fellows working across our various projects, areas to support our existing work and to help develop new work. This can include co-counseling on litigation with prominent law firms and non-litigation activities such as transactional legal services, legislative and public policy advocacy, and public education on important civil rights matters.
So each year, the Lawyers Committee annually sponsors the one-year George and Lindsay Civil Rights Fellowship. The Lindsay Fellowship provides an opportunity for recent law school graduates to become familiar with civil rights practice by working with many of the nation's leading civil rights experts at the national office of the Lawyers Committee in Washington, D.C. George Lindsay was a very accomplished attorney, a partner at Debevoise and Plimpton, who devoted much of his career to the fight for civil rights, working with a number of organizations, including the Lawyers Committee, and really was a shining example of how the Lawyers Committee works with the private bar to advance civil rights and racial justice, and how successful that has been as a model for civil rights enforcement, even against the backdrop of changing administrations and leadership at the Department of Justice. As Brian mentioned, these fellows are often incredibly immersed in the work that we do, and it is a one-year placement. And so addition to that fellowship, we also have the externally funded sponsored fellowships needed.
And with those fellowships, the externally funded fellowships, thank you, Adani. With those, the applicant generally comes to us, to the organization with funding already confirmed or in the process of being confirmed, whether that funding is through your law school or through another organization, through a firm. And we accept these applications on a rolling basis with an understanding that they each tend to have different due dates. So for the SCADN, which is my fellowship, or Equal Justice Works or Justice Catalyst, for example, these 1 or 2 year fellowships, the Lawyers Committee accepts a number of applicants to develop a project proposal and then obtain funding from another organization. And while the due dates for these applications, particularly the SCADN, Equal Justice Works, and Justice Catalyst, tend to be sort of around September or August or September, if that's still correct, we do encourage reaching out to us earlier rather than later so that we can, we will be sort of interviewing applicants, and we can sort of commit to an applicant and be a part of developing the project proposal to ensure your likelihood of success during that application. Because at the Lawyers Committee, we want to be supportive from the beginning of the fellowship application process externally through the entire fellowship. We also accept fellows from firms, so through firm fellowship programs. And typically in that situation, the firm will reach out to us. And however, they do have that application process has similar requirements, including a legal writing sample and a resume and an interview. And then we'll kick it over to Sophia for the application overview.
Yeah, so you won't be surprised by what our application requires. It's very similar to most other fellowships. We are looking first and foremost for a strong commitment to public service and civil rights and racial justice, and ideally some experience in your resume working with or showing ties to communities of color. The most important thing that we want to see overall in your application is how you think about and analyze racial justice issues, both in your own life and at a structural and societal level. Other than that, we're looking, as most other organizations are, for excellent research, writing, and analytical skills, for strong communication skills in both legal and non-legal settings, and an ability to work cooperatively across a number of interest areas and projects, and to develop strong working relationships both with colleagues across the Lawyers Committee and across different issue areas, and of course with diverse clientele and various community organizations that we partner closely with. So brass tacks, what does that mean? In your initial application, we're just asking for a resume, a cover letter explaining your interest in the fellowship, a legal writing sample that shows us your writing, and an unofficial or official law school transcript.
And for the review process for the applications, we are reviewing them all on a rolling basis, including the ones with the deadline, including the applications that have a deadline of June 15th of 2020, and they will remain open and are currently up on the website. The deadline will be strictly enforced, so we do ask that you get those applications in by June 15th. They will be reviewed on, like I said, a rolling basis, with semifinalists being notified in the first or second week of July as it relates to an interview. If you are selected as a semifinalist, we will be asking to have you submit a list of 3 professional or academic references or 2 letters of recommendation, a statement of career aspirations, and a short project proposal. Again, those 3 things will only be required of you if you are a semifinalist. Again, and the semifinalists will be notified in the first or second week of July. We plan to wrap up the whole review, interview, and selection process by the end of July. So decisions will be sent out by the end of July. And all of the application materials can be submitted through the Podio link. So ensure that before submitting those applications, you do have all of the necessary requirements completed and everything attached, either individually or as one succinct PDF document.
Yeah, and I think the bottom line to take away from that is that we are going to be reviewing applications on a rolling basis. So the sooner you get your materials in, the better.
So you said a little bit about how the legal fellows fit into our work. Most legal fellows will be working with one particular one of our projects, whether it's voting rights or economic justice, what have you, ones I mentioned earlier. Some might be working across project areas, and we certainly, as an organization, look for opportunities to work intersectionally on issues. So really, the experience of each fellow is gonna really vary based on which project they're working in, and some of the projects are vary in size and have different workflows. So we're all going to share a little bit. I can start just by sharing. I started in September of 2018, right before a midterm federal election, and one of the first assignments I worked on was emergency litigation in Gwinnett County, Georgia, where the county was throwing out ballots that had made an immaterial error on the ballot in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and immaterial in the sense that it wasn't immaterial in determining their qualifications. So, for example, some voters had put their date of birth instead of the current year on the envelope. Other voters had put the current year instead of the date of birth. And if that sounds confusing, it's because some of the forms requested date of birth and some of the forms requested current year. Of course, neither is material. They have date of birth already saved. So it's still one of my highlights is taking declarations from affected voters. So, and really working with the voter, making sure we had all the facts, drafted them, make sure that was right, get a signature, just make sure it's in front of the court, totally emergency litigation, and then to have some of that I worked on, and some contribute to some of the briefing too, get cited by the judge in an order that said several hundred ballots were going to be counted, and then be able to reach back out to that voter and say your ballots can be counted, still gives me chills. It's exactly why I went to law school, and I had the opportunity to do it within 2 months of joining the Lawyers Committee. So that's one of my highlights.
As someone who's in the fellowship right now, I am really delighted to report that I have a lot of autonomy over my project. I know that some folks before I applied for, when I was applying for fellowships at other organizations, they had horror stories where they had applied, not horror stories, but they had applied to work on a particular project, and then the needs of the organization sort of eclipsed the project and they didn't get to work on it at all. That has not been my experience at all. I have had a lot of support from my team on the Fair Housing and Community Development team. And so I work primarily with folks in Baltimore, Black folks in Baltimore who are low-income tenants. I do direct representation of tenants in rent court, and I support tenant-led organizing here, as well as I get to do some transactional work supporting community land trusts and housing cooperatives. And that's what I do in and out, day in, day out up here. And I, of course, go to the DC office for organization-wide events and sometimes for meetings, but for the most part, I just have a lot of support doing this work here. That said, I'm not cut off from the organization or the work that the Fair Housing Community Development Project does in any way. And I actually recently got pulled into a case that's really related to the work that I do. In some ways, it's outside of Baltimore, but we have a case called, we're part of a case called Miller v. Vilsack, which is where we are representing the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and intervening in a case about federal relief funds for Black farmers, which is directly connected to my work, which is, and the spirit of my work is about ensuring that Black people, particularly low-income Black people, have access to land and housing to be well and to thrive. And so being able to join that litigation is something that is very large and not something I could ever be a part of just on my own at this stage in my career, for lack of my own, I don't have my own practice. I'm just a few years out of law school, but getting to be a part of that is extremely exciting. And I don't think it's something that I would have been able to do at sort of a smaller organization that's not so nationally connected.
I'll jump in and say I started on the Voting Rights Project at the end of 2020. And I think the sort of most distinctive thing about the fellowship was just that I was welcomed in immediately to jump onto major cases, and to be a part of the team working on them, to work on briefing, to work directly with clients in helping them to draft declarations and the sections of our complaint that referred to their lived experiences and their personal experiences with voting systems we were challenging. And so you know, fellows are such an integral part of the work we do. And they're, even if you have a general fellowship the way that I did, there's no way you're sort of going to be left out of anything major. I, for example, jumped immediately into Texas and to a challenge to the voter suppression bill that was moving through the Texas legislature, Senate Bill 1, and worked on, you know, helped on drafting the complaint, on speaking directly with our clients. Now we're further along in that litigation, and I'm also working on the Texas redistricting litigation. We just have a lot going on, and you will be a part of all of it. You are a real member of the team, even if you're only in the organization for a small amount of time.
I think that's the perfect segue. So when I joined in 2020, it was in October of 2020, so right up before the election, and as a fellow with the Digital Justice Initiative, we kind of work on our own matter specifically as it relates to digital justice, but we also work with a lot of the other projects within the Lawyers Committee. So I came on and I immediately started working on a voting rights case as it related to robocalls that were going out and were violating the Voting Rights Act and causing harm to Black and Brown voters as they were getting false information about mail-in voting and also in-person voting. And so that was kind of the first case that I came in and worked on. I was, as Sophia mentioned, just immediately put in to all of the calls, all of the conversations, and it wasn't kind of a bad experience in terms of jumping in head first. It was really, here's the hands-on experience. Here's how we got here. Here's where we're looking to go, and having all of that knowledge and being able to kind of really join the team and start working immediately was something I really appreciated. And the rest of the year of the rest of the first year of my fellowship was really dedicated to working with a lot of other projects, whether it was on amicus briefs or just having different policy conversations as it relates to digital facial recognition, artificial intelligence, and how that kind of relates and intersects with criminal justice, the Criminal Justice Project, fair housing, and economic justice projects as well.
So we wanted to leave some space for questions and answers. And for folks who might be watching this recording of this webinar, which will be posted to our website, you can always email questions to fellowship@lawyerscommittee.org. But with that, interested if the folks who are, if you have any questions from the folks who are with us live. I think you can put them in the chat. I don't really know how that works logistically, but we'll be able to see them, or we can have some help looking at them.
So I know we've gotten questions prior to this as well. And one of them is, what was your experience with applying? While I had a project-specific fellowship, mine was a typical application, but I will pass it over to one of the others who had kind of more specific as it relates to externally funded, and Lindsay.
I can jump in with like a sort of imperfect experience to just like, and that's not the Lawyers Committee's fault. It's entirely my own. Just so you all know that, like, you know, there are these guidelines. It is a rolling fellowship, you know, sort of the applications are rolling, and we encourage you to get things in early. And also, you know, we're coming out of a pandemic. There are things that, you might get this information on the later end. It's okay. We absolutely don't want to chill or discourage applications, by the due date. That's totally fine. And actually I submitted mine later than that. So my story is that I had been I was working at a plaintiff's firm back in 2021 at the time when the pandemic broke loose, and there were a number of folks. I lived in Baltimore at the time, I still do, and there were a number of folks on the ground who were organizing, trying to respond, putting together mutual aid, and in particular, we're trying to figure out how to respond to the impending eviction crisis, because Baltimore is an extremely poor city. The rates of poverty are extremely high. Poverty is extremely racialized. The wealth gap is one of the highest in the nation. And so and rent court prior to the pandemic was extremely, I think it was described to me as being, the Wild West on multiple occasions by different people who practiced in that court. And it's only gotten worse with the pandemic. And so I sort of jumped into organizing and tried to support with my brand new legal degree in whatever ways that I could. And one of the things that some of the organizers were interested in was getting support building out a participatory eviction defense or housing defense program, which is a specific kind of approach to organizing where folks who are most impacted lead and support each other in their cases, and then they organize around it, and there's some legal support. But it was really difficult to find an attorney who was able to do that, just because the resources here are stretched pretty thin. And so folks were working all the time. There wasn't really sort of like a spare lawyer. And so I thought to myself, oh, well, I can do this. This is something that I can do. So I talked with organizers and I developed this project over the course of the summer. And then by the time I sort of like did it backwards, right? I was like, oh no, I also need an organization to host me. And there weren't any local organizations who were able to host me at the time because of the pandemic, because of concerns about budgets and things like that, or budget shortfalls for nonprofits. And so I ended up reaching out to the Lawyers Committee, I think in like late July or early August, which was late. And I immediately got a call back. I told them about my project, and we got and we started moving. And I apologize, if there are any members of the fellowships committee who were working that year on my application, but I sort of immediately hit the ground running, got accepted, and we worked together to refine my application proposal for SCADN and EJW, and everything worked out really quite well for me. Again, maybe not the fellowships committee, but there was a lot of generosity in that process. And so and that generosity and kindness and patience and support has carried me through. Here I am, 9 months into my fellowship, and I'm still having a great time.
I can talk a little bit about my experience too. I applied to both the Lindsay and the more general fellowships, and ended up sort of toward the end of August or maybe the beginning of August, being selected as a semi-finalist for the Lindsay, but ultimately didn't get the Lindsay, and so moved forward with some other fellowship applications, and continued trying to get my project funded. And then it turned out that I saw in January of my senior 3L spring of law school, I saw that the Lawyers Committee did school sponsored fellowships sometimes. And so I got back in touch with the folks that I had interviewed with, and I really enjoyed getting to know during the Lindsay process. And they were immediately responsive, immediately jumped into helping me apply for funding through my school, again, focusing on my same project, which was sort of working at the intersection of the criminal system and voting, and the increasing criminalization of the right to vote throughout many states. And was able to very quickly, maybe within 4 or 6 weeks, had secured funding from my law school, and had signed on to work with the Lawyers Committee. So I think that's a useful a useful story just to show that the fellowship process is, there are so many deadlines. It's very competitive. There are just a lot of competing things happening throughout the process. You're sort of trying to make an organization happy, and you're trying to make a sponsor happy. And there's a lot there, but I think it is worth understanding that at the Lawyers Committee in particular, there are a lot of different opportunities. You can apply through your school, you can apply with EJW or Skadden, you can apply for the Lindsay. And so what I would really encourage folks to use all of those avenues, and to, you only have to submit a single application. You can just say in your cover letter that you are applying for various things. You don't need to send duplicative applications, but it just goes to show that there are a lot of different ways to work at the Lawyers Committee through a fellowship, and we'd encourage you to try them all, since the process is complex and there are various deadlines and all that.
Yeah, and I think, that kind of drives home all of what y'all shared really drives home. The bottom line is making an impact, right? It's moving the work forward and serving communities of color. And we as a committee, we want to see that you're ready to do that from the get-go. You're ready to come in and make an impact right away. It almost doesn't matter how you get to the work, right? You want to have an opportunity to make an impact. This is the work that you want to be doing, obviously, if you're considering applying. My story is maybe similar in some ways to Sophia's, because we ended up in the same kind of school-sponsored fellowship. But when I was applying, I didn't. I went to law school to do voting rights work on access to democracy. I had been exposed to the Lawyers Committee's work previously. I had actually volunteered for election protection in law school, which is the 866 hour vote, nonpartisan voter protection program that the Lawyers Committee is one of the main conveners of. So I was familiar with the work, and I really just wanted to do general voting rights litigation and supporting through election protection. And at the time, I didn't think that either Skadden or EJW would take on such a proposal. I think that I felt like it needed to be more specific. And so I didn't, and I also knew that I had the school funded fellowship available with separate internal application, but I felt confident I'd get it. And so I ended up just moving forward. Just with the Lawyers Committee, I reached out to John Greenbaum, who I'd connected with previously, who's our chief counsel, and basically applied through that, had an interview, and just did that was my one. I just like all eggs in that basket, and I feel very fortunate that it worked out, and again was able to come in and exactly what I'd hoped. So I definitely worked out that way.
I will add one thing about the fellowship opportunities. You're not only going to be working, most likely you're not only going to be working on one project. While you might be assigned to one project, there's oftentimes a lot of overlap between different projects. So you'll get an opportunity to work on, issues, say, housed within one specific project, but of course you'll likely have overlap with others. So there's really an opportunity here to, work on civil rights matters that might be very specific to what your interests are, while also getting experience learning about other areas of civil rights and kind of the intersections between those. And that is something, we are happy to, and by all means, include in your cover letter where your interests might lie, so that we have that understanding. But it is really a unique opportunity where you do get to work on a lot of different projects, both litigation-based and more activism-based as well, activism and advocacy-based as well.
That's such a good point, Adani. And I just would add that also means that if you want to include in your cover letter specific issues you might want to work on, or a specific project you're considering, we would love to hear about that. But that project does not necessarily need to fit into a single bucket. There are many instances in which folks are working across projects at the intersection of several different issues. And so that can also be a part of your project if that's where your interest lies.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, just a big part of sharing that with us is telling us why, why is that what you want to work on, or why is that how you want to work on this issue. It's important.
Are there
Any other-
any other questions? Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say the same thing. Any other questions from attendees?
All right, good. Well, thank you all so much for joining. We hope you will apply. Everything is online on the Lawyers Committee website. Again, if you'd like to apply to sort of multiple fellowships, you can just send a single application package in and just note in your cover letter what you're applying to. And we really look forward to hearing from you and to learning more about you. Anything else, guys?
Send us an email if you have any other questions, fellowship@lawyerscommittee.org.
Yes, please do.
Is it fellowship or fellowships?
Either one, we'll get to
Either
us.
one will work. Thank you.
Oh, that's news to me.
But fellowship is the official one. No S.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing your applications.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.